Hello and welcome. I'm Leanne Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. A watershed moment. EU leaders hold an emergency summit in Brussels on defence and Ukraine aid. Trump issues a last warning to Hamas to release hostages in Gaza. And UK Defence Secretary John Healey touches down in Washington for talks with his US counterpart, Pete Hegseth. To our top story, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has met with European leaders at a security summit in Brussels. The emergency talks come days after the US suspended military aid and suspended intelligence sharing. The president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, called it a watershed moment for Europe and Ukraine, adding it's so important that we do stand together. Meanwhile, Zelensky thanked Europe for its support. Let's take a look.
We are very thankful that we are not alone, and these are not just words, we feel it. It's very important. You made a strong signal to Ukrainian people, to Ukrainian warriors, to civilians, to all our families, and it's great that we are not alone. We feel it and we know it. Thank you so much for everything.
French President Emmanuel Macron was also at the summit when the Kremlin responded to comments he made yesterday about an alleged Russian threat to the European Union. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov rejected Macron's claims and called them unintelligent, baseless and extremely confrontational. Here's just what he had to say.
Of course, this is a threat to Russia. If they consider us a threat, if they call a meeting of the chiefs of general staff of European countries and Britain, if they say that it is necessary to use nuclear weapons, to prepare to use nuclear weapons against Russia, this is, of course, a threat. And with regard to these, well, frankly speaking, unintelligent accusations of Russia preparing a war against Europe and France, Putin has repeatedly spoken out, calling such thoughts delusional nonsense. Probably, for any more or less sane person, it is completely clear that Russia does not need this. We will absolutely not just calmly observe such actions, and especially against the backdrop of Macron's nervous statement yesterday that Russia is a threat to Europe. And therefore, if this is a threat, then troops must be sent against this threat.
The EU summit comes days after the US suspended military aid and intelligence sharing. To talk more about this, I'm joined by former Trump state campaign chair, Rob Artlett, who is in Washington. Rob, thank you so much for joining me. We haven't heard from President Donald Trump yet, but how do you think he will react to today's meeting between Europe and Ukraine in Brussels?
It's an honor and pleasure to be with you and your audience, and thank you for the opportunity. I would say, quite frankly, that President Trump is very focused on bringing peace between Russia and Ukraine. And I think he would welcome the conversations between the EU and Ukraine. At the end of the day, President Trump is going to do what is required from our friends and from our partners in the region to make it be known that the expectation and almost a demand is peace. Let's not forget who President Trump is. He is a deal maker. And how do you bring a deal to the table to bring peace and prosperity to the region? Well, it all begins by conversations. It all begins by understanding each other's side. It also is an understanding of transparency and accountability through this process. So make no mistake that President Trump is very focused on bringing peace and prosperity to the area and to stop and to halt the war. He has already stated that he is demanding, if you would, a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. And under the previous administration, under President Biden, I would say that America was a passive supporter with a blank check. We gave billions of dollars to Ukraine without that transparency and accountability. What I believe what President Trump is doing, especially with the mineral deal between the U.S. and Ukraine, is no longer just supporting Ukraine, but being a partner with Ukraine. Big difference between the previous administration and President Trump. If we have a vested interest in Ukraine with this mineral deal, then I will tell you that the adversaries or Russia will not be invading Ukraine with Americans' presence and Americans' partnership with Ukraine. So I think it's a very vital process. And I do believe, as early as this morning, that President Zelensky has reached back to the White House, reached back to President Trump, and did apologize for what happened at the White House last week, and is ready to proceed with signing of the mineral deal between Ukraine and the U.S. government with President Trump.
Rob, today a Ukrainian ambassador has reportedly said the US has joined an axis of evil in destroying world order along with Russia. Trump hasn't reacted to this, but does insist, as you just said to me, he wants peace. Do you think his plan to achieve peace in the way that he's going about it is backfiring to some extent?
Not at all. I would say what you're seeing is it's a leader. President Trump is a leader, and he's going to demand accountability and transparency in this process. For anybody to say otherwise is just ignorant and irresponsible. Make no mistake, when President Trump was in his first term 4 years ago, there were no new wars in this world. There was no conflict between Russia and Ukraine at that time. There was no war between Hamas and Israel at that time. So President Trump is the president of peace. Make no mistake, that's who he is, that's what he is, and that's what you see in President Trump and in the White House. It's called leadership. So for anybody to say that, well, they're not paying attention, because there's been conflict and bloodshed and murders without President Trump prior to this current administration. And now that he's in office, you will see at all costs peace and prosperity. Not to mention, this is President Trump's final term. He will not be president after this current term. So I believe President Trump is also very focused on his legacy. He wants not just short-term peace, but he also is looking for long-term peace between Ukraine and Russia, as well as Hamas and the Palestine people, and that of Israel. President Trump is also thinking about his legacy. Therefore, I believe he's very focused on long-term peace, not just short-term peace.
This week, Trump has made some dramatic decisions when it does come to foreign policy. The latest is negotiating with Hamas, for example. His supporters will say, as I'm sure you agree with, it's the art of the deal and negotiating tactics. But critics really do argue he's not weighing up the risks to this type of diplomacy. What do you think of this? Do you think sort of going around the official channels that were always followed by the Biden administration is the right way to do things?
Well, let's just talk about what the Biden administration did. They did nothing other than write checks and played both sides. That's what they did. They funneled lots of money to the terrorist organization of Hamas, to the tune of $2 billion, as it was reported this last weekend here in America. So President Trump, again, is not going to give blank checks to anybody. He will seek accountability and transparency in this process. And again, what did President Biden do? Well, he created two conflicts in this world. Lots of people have been murdered. Lots of people, there was lots of bloodshed and lots of destruction under a President Biden. President Trump they can't say that about President Trump. He's here to focus on bringing peace. And you are correct. It is all about the art of the deal. And it all starts with communication. Why shouldn't Hamas and America be in communication? Why not? Why shouldn't they be in communication to learn from each other? And at the end of the day, the goal is, again, I'll say it again, the goal is peace and prosperity. And President Trump has said more than once, what does that look like specifically in Gaza? Well, he says that he would like to see America control Gaza. He also used the word ownership. So what does that really mean? I don't know. I'm not going to speak directly for President Trump, but what I do know is that America has done this before. We could look at Puerto Rico. That is a U.S. territory today. We could look at Guam, and that is also a U.S. territory today. Are those people better off today because of the American presence? I would say yes. Would the Palestine people be better off with an American presence in Gaza versus that of Hamas? Think about that for a moment. What we know about Hamas is they've brought bloodshed and murder amongst the Palestine people. Would that happen if U.S. was there as a presence, as a level of security and prosperity for the people? I would say they would be safer with an American presence in Gaza than that of a terrorist organization called Hamas.
Just very briefly, in 60 seconds or so, what are you hearing from former Republicans and Republicans, you know, who you, of course, know, on Trump's first 6 weeks in office? What's the feeling there?
It's a great question. I would say that Trump 2.0, the second administration of President Trump, is a lot more focused and a lot more resolve as far as getting things done. He knows this is his final term. He learned a lot of lessons from the first administration. He learned that you can't trust people. He was not a politician 4 years ago or 8 years ago when he was first elected in that first term. He is now, I would say, is a politician with experience and knowing who to trust and who not to trust. And I will tell you, I feel a lot more confident, as do the American people, about a second term of President Trump, because he's focused on bringing results and not just rhetoric of the media here in America and that of the Democrats. So I'm excited that President Trump is in office for a second term, and he's bringing the right people around him that are going to get things done. That's what they're focused on, is bringing results to the American people and to our friends and allies around the world.
Well, Rob, he's certainly been getting things done in the first 6 weeks, hasn't he? Sorry, Rob, we're going to have to leave it there. Yeah, former Trump state campaign chair, Rob Artlett, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We can now go to our correspondent, William Denselow, who joins us from Brussels. So, William, today's meeting has been described as a watershed moment and appears to be a sign of strength from Europe and Ukraine in light of events this week. How's it going down there?
Well, spend, spend, spend was the message we've heard at the start of the summit from Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Prime Minister. That's a clear reference to this Rearm Europe plan that was presented by the European Commission a few days ago. That would free up roughly $840 billion when it comes to boosting Europe's defence capacities. That has been a central part of these discussions here at this summit in Brussels. Also very much in focus, support for Ukraine, both in the short term and the long term. We've heard from Ukraine's president, who is here at the European Council. He says that what was discussed was more in the short term ammunition for Ukraine, more air defence systems, as well as discussing things like potential accession to the European Union as well. One other thing that has been key in these negotiations, these discussions, has been Ukraine's long-term security guarantees. Things like this possibility of Europe sending peacekeepers to Ukraine should there be a peace agreement reached in the future.
Yes, absolutely, William. Spend, spend, spend has been the message. Meanwhile, as we did see earlier today, the Kremlin is very clear about its position with a tough-talking statement, largely aimed at President Macron, right?
That's absolutely right. Of course, we heard in a state address on Wednesday evening Emmanuel Macron suggesting that he could include more European allies under France's nuclear deterrent, nuclear umbrella. That has irked the Kremlin. We've had a very strong response to them. There's been a little bit of reaction to that from European leaders here at this summit, likes of Lithuania and Poland describing it as an interesting proposal. The Danish Prime Minister saying that while they're not actively looking at that option, all things are at the moment on the table when it comes to boosting Ukraine and Europe's defence capabilities.
William Denselow there in Brussels for us. Thank you so much for keeping across all of that news in Brussels. Much appreciated. Let's continue with this conversation now with retired US Brigadier-General Peter Zwack. Peter, good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining me. What have you made of the developments in Brussels today, and what impact will that have on the conflict in regards to Ukrainian and Russian morale?
First, good evening to you and your viewers and listeners. We are at I would submit we are in a really, really critical period as far as what I would call the orientation, the coordination of the nations of what I call the free-minded world. In watching and in the Macron's speech, pulling together the EU, NATO meetings, and the rhetoric is so high. And I think that the Russians will have constantly mentioned nuclear weapons as a threat. If this happens, that red line's crossed. We could do this and this, even very, very recently, which I think led to President Macron's statement. We are, we've emerged, we thought, from the Cold War, and the world since the end of World War II, and then 30 years later, 40 years later, the end of the Soviet Union laid out a different path. We call it the New World Order. That grates on some nations, but there was so much constructed, and to include the UN, EU, NATO, all kinds of NGOs, and that has been withering away, whether with Russian moves to emasculate that, but also, sadly, in the rhetoric of my president, my U.S. president, who seems to be untethering or trying to untether the United States from the precepts and structures that we have thrived under since the end of the Second World War and the end of the Cold War. So this is a really, really dangerous period. Ukraine, you wouldn't have found this dialogue, this anti-Ukraine dialogue, out of our White House 8 years ago, 10 years ago. And we've been consistent throughout, and Europe has been consistent about. Remember, Europe has been scarred by the memory of the Munich Accords in 1938, where concessions were made, and Czechoslovakia was literally forced into the Nazis' arms, and the West, before the war, basically acceded to that and called it peace in our time. We want that.
Peter,
we all want that.
Peter, just quickly, I wanted to just step in there to ask you, but doesn't President Trump have a point here? We're talking about these alliances that have been in place for years, but he's been adamant, even in his first term, about Europe spending more on defense. And it's taken until now for them to announce the spending plans and to bolster the region. Do you think Europe has been relying far too much on the US?
It's a good question. It's a nuanced question. We could say that, but just remember what Europe looked like in 1946. It was prostrate. And yes, Marshall Plan and a lot of other things were built, both on the military and humanitarian side. Yes, it may have created some dependencies. But at the same point, I will submit that we, for the United States and its military allies, these things also were good for American business. And we were not totally taken advantage of. We had allies, one of the most precious things in the world. We had good commerce with a rebuilding Europe. And we had like-minded nations that had been tearing each other apart, literally twice in the 20th century. And we got to find a way to nuance and balance that structure. Basically, going all in with strong-arming Ukraine that is in a desperate fight against an aggressor that we haven't seen of the type since 1939, the Nazis and the Soviets in Poland. It would be wrong just to pull out militarily in a time of dire need for Ukraine. Yes, it'll be good we keep our links, and yes, it would be good to get some added business going, but we have to keep the bedrock of our foundations that have worked now for 80 years, which will help the peace. It will deter aggressive nations, such as Russia. If something happens to Ukraine, the whole security consciousness of Europe will be severely stressed. And I think
Peter, I'm so sorry. We're just going to have to leave it there. But thank you so much for joining me, and all your insights were absolutely fascinating. Hope to have you back on soon. Retired US Brigadier-General Peter Zwack, thank you very much.
God bless.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. President Trump has said he'll temporarily pause the new 25% tariffs imposed on Canada and Mexico for car makers. The one-month exemption is for cars made in North America that comply with the continent's existing free trade agreement. And in the last hour, Trump's also said he will pause most of the tariffs he recently imposed on Mexican imports after talks with the Mexican president. New Zealand has fired its most senior envoy to the UK over remarks he made against President Trump. High Commissioner Phil Goff compared US attempts to end the Russian war in Ukraine to the 1938 Munich Agreement, which allowed Adolf Hitler to take part of Czechoslovakia. Goff also reportedly questioned Trump's understanding of history whilst he was at an event in London. His comments came after Trump paused military aid to Kyiv and after his clash with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office last week. South Korean fighter jets have accidentally dropped 8 bombs in a civilian area. 15 people have been injured in the incident, which took place during a live-fire military drill. The incident occurred in the city of Poncheon, near North Korea, involving the Air Force KF-16 aircraft. And in England, doctors are calling for a complete ban on hitting children. The Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health is calling on the government to amend the law, which currently allows smacking when it amounts to a reasonable punishment. There is no evidence that smacking has any positive effect on a child's well-being. The Department for Education said the government had no plans to change the law. President Trump has issued what he described as a last warning to Hamas to release hostages in Gaza. In response, Hamas accused the president of encouraging Israel to break the ceasefire deal between the two sides. In a statement on Truth Social, Trump said, "Release all of the hostages now, not later, and immediately return all of the dead bodies of the people you murdered, or it is over for you. This is your last warning." Hours before Trump made the threats, the White House confirmed it was holding direct talks with Hamas over the remaining hostages. We can now go live to Washington to talk to our correspondent there, Nick Harper. Nick, thank you so much for joining me. So this latest ultimatum by Trump is a dramatic shift from decades of US policy.
Well, absolutely, Leanne. A complete break from long-standing norms for US policy. First, the fact that US has decided to engage directly with Hamas, because according to US policy, up until now, the US would use intermediaries to speak to groups that they have designated as terrorist organizations. And obviously, Hamas falls into that category, which is why up until now they've been using Qatar and Egypt as their intermediaries. But here we have the US directly engaging with the group, and then Donald Trump issuing this ultimatum on social media, during which he also wrote that this was your last warning, and saying if the hostages were not freed, you are dead. It echoes very much the ultimatum that he put on Hamas before his inauguration on January the 20th, at which point he told them there would be hell to pay if they didn't manage to agree some sort of deal that led to the release of the hostages. So certainly tremendous pressure here coming from the White House.
Yes, indeed. And Hamas is now accusing Trump of encouraging Israel to break the ceasefire deal. This is a pretty big accusation. We know that deal's fragile as it is, Nick.
Yeah, certainly very fragile, and it comes as no surprise that Hamas has rejected this ultimatum, instead firing back their own fiery words, saying that the US is now part of the Israeli plan to try and break up the whole ceasefire deal and stop Israel moving on to part 2 of the plan. Some of the language coming from Hamas was that Trump's repeated threats allows Netanyahu to evade the agreement and tightens the siege and starvation of our people. Remember, after the end of phase 1 on Saturday, Israel decided it would block all aid entering into Gaza. And there is this concern that we should now be into phase 2, that should be part of the negotiations that are ongoing. But here Hamas is saying that the only way to get the remaining hostages released is to continue with negotiations and to move to phase 2 of the deal.
Nick Harper in Washington, thank you so much for joining me. Let's get into this further with a former Israeli forces spokesman, Doran Spielman. Doran, thank you so much for joining me. So the US president says he'll send Israel everything it needs to finish the job. What's your reaction to President Trump's statement and his threats to Hamas?
Thank you for having me. Well, I can tell you if any country had 251 people taken hostage and 1,200 people slaughtered by an invasion from a terrorist army, they would want nothing more than to defeat that terrorist army and bring their hostages home, which is precisely what Israel has been trying to do since October 8th. And we've had ground campaigns on Gaza. We've tried to defeat Hamas. However, there have been limitations in arms that Israel's experienced. And to have the head of the most powerful country in the world recognize the absolute injustice that there are, as we're speaking, 59 people still beneath the ground, 24 of which are assumed to be alive, and say we will give you whatever means necessary to defeat these Hamas killers, it obviously falls on welcome ears in Israel. And I hope for most people around the world to understand the situation. I would hope, Leanne, that we would hear other world leaders say the same thing. It seems to simply be the right decision. Defeat evil, allow Israel to bring its people home, and make Hamas leave Gaza.
By sending a so-called last warning, Hamas have actually responded and accused Trump of encouraging Israel to break the ceasefire deal. We know this is extremely fragile at the moment. What do you make of this? And is there a chance of this ceasefire breaking down and the war resuming?
We've said from the very beginning, Israel cannot live with Hamas on our border. Any deal that would leave the Hamas terror regime that has attacked and killed thousands of Israelis, that has shattered and ruined the lives of the people of Gaza and destroyed Gaza completely, not to mention diverted all of that money that came in from the Gulf states, from the United States, the UN, into tunnels underneath the ground and held that civilian population hostage. Any deal that leaves Hamas in charge is something Israel cannot live with, which I think is perfectly understandable. And of course, Israel insists on this. And therefore, at this stage of the deal, Hamas is not willing to leave the Gaza Strip, to lay down their arms. Israel has said since October 8th, all Hamas had to do was lay down their arms, give up, return our hostages, and we would never have entered the Gaza Strip. So therefore, we're at the end of phase one, heading to phase two, and there's no sign that Hamas is willing to admit what they did was wrong and to leave Gaza. Until that happens, Israel cannot agree to any situation that would keep a terror regime just a couple miles over our border.
Whilst all of this is actually happening, Israel is sending tanks into the West Bank, and this is happening for the first time in decades. What kind of message does this send to the rest of the world when it comes to peace and negotiating the second phase of the ceasefire deal?
I think that Israel has been very, very clear. Israel has lived with a very complicated situation for many, many years. There are Palestinians and Jews that are living in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. When those Palestinians that are associated with Hamas cross into Israeli territory and gun down families, two young men that were driving their car that stopped at a crosswalk that were killed at point blank range, buses, 5 of which blew up just a few weeks ago, families that have been killed even this week in Haifa, in the middle of Israel, a Jewish Arab city where people were killed, soldiers run over, an old man shot. When this is what is emanating from the West Bank, I think Israel's sending a clear message. Terror will not be tolerated, and we would hope that anyone around the world that wants to understand peace and terror do not go together. In order to have peace, you must have strength to prevent terror. We can see the same thing playing itself out in many other regions of the world. Peace doesn't come by negotiating or being friendly to a terrorist who wants nothing more to kill you. You have to have, on one hand, strength, and on the other hand, hope that strength will establish a situation where ultimately, without terror, we can establish peace. But strength comes first.
Strength comes first, indeed. But President Trump has met a group of recently released hostages at the White House. 5 U.S. citizens are still being held captive by Hamas. Could his stance help or hinder the return of these hostages and the remaining hostages that have been held?
Leanne, it is a great question, and I wish I had the clear answer. All of our hearts break for the people that are in Gaza, and all we want is to bring these people home. And therefore, you're asking the right question, and no one is really sure of the answer. Is it via some type of conciliation that would bring them home. Well, we've done that. We've had a ransom. The first phase was a ransom where we released back into Gaza and back into Judea and Samaria 1,000 Hamas terrorists, 350 of which carried out attacks in their blood on their hands. I mean, that is the cost of trying to bring people home. The second phase requires even more killers and murderers to be released on the street. And so obviously, in the rare chance we would get people back, you're allowing murderers to go out. I think what President Trump is saying is he's clearing the table. He's saying there's a simple formula here. There's a right and there is wrong. It is wrong that Hamas invaded Israel. It is wrong that they took the hostages. And the only thing that is right is that they immediately return them and leave Gaza. It's a very simple answer, and I think that it is what needs to be listened to. Anything else is simply Israel being blackmailed by a terrorist entity so that we can try to pull whoever's left alive, and many of them have been killed, out of the dungeons of Gaza.
I just want to bring you back to another point that we were talking about earlier. And Israel has imposed a total blockade on all goods entering Gaza, demanding that Hamas release the hostages. But since the start of Israel's war on Gaza, at least 46,700 people in Gaza have been killed. This is becoming something that needs to end really quickly. And how do you think that you're going to find peace? Because this is what Donald Trump wants. He wants the killing to stop. He wants it to end quickly. Do you think that you can get to a position where you can negotiate peace?
If negotiating peace means leaving in the same brutal, murderous regime called Hamas, that is responsible for killing Israelis and responsible for those 46,000 Gazans, at least half of whom, by the way, were terrorists, then it is absolutely impossible, because all we will do is leave the same terror entity inside Gaza that will carry out the exact same acts against Israel and terrorize the same Gazan people again. There is no quick fix here. The only fix here is to uproot a problem that has metastasized over decades, that has implanted itself inside Gaza, that has brainwashed the population, has held them hostage, has created the largest underground terror network in any single place in the world, launched the deadliest attack on Israel. The only answer is going to be to uproot that cancer, remove them, and reset the entire area. Nobody wants to have to go through this, but this is what has to be done to start a new life for the Gazan people. I think President Trump is very bold and courageous for making this plan. People are afraid to make change. It's been the same plan again and again and again: appease Hamas, conciliate with Hamas. And the result is that we now have thousands of Israelis dead and thousands of Gazans dead. We have to make the difficult decision, Leanne, to go in and finish the problem. And there is only one way of doing it: unconditionally destroying Hamas. If they remain in Gaza, it is a threat to Israel, it is a threat to the people of Gaza.
Doran Spielman, former Israeli forces spokesman, thank you so much for your insights this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Let's take a look at some other stories making the headlines today. US prosecutors have charged 12 Chinese hackers over an alleged scheme that targeted dissidents in the US. The hackers, who include 2 officials, allegedly sold dissidents' data to China and targeted several US government bodies, including the Treasury. China rejected the accusations, dismissing them as groundless. Russia has appointed senior diplomat Alexander Darkiv as its ambassador to the US, filling the post that has actually been vacant since October. The US approved Darkiv's appointment during talks between US and Russian delegations in Istanbul. His appointment is the latest sign of easing tensions between the two countries as they seek to repair ties and end the war in Ukraine. Tropical cyclone Alfred has stalled off Australia's east coast as officials close airports and schools, and millions do brace for its impact. Authorities have warned of heavy rain and wind and called on residents in flood-prone areas to evacuate. The storm is predicted to make landfall near Brisbane on Saturday. The city was last hit by a cyclone back in 1974. Scientists have discovered a new part of the immune system and say it's a potential source for antibiotics. The experts' discovery focuses on proteasomes, which recycle proteins. Experiments showed they can also detect bacteria in cells and build defenses against it. The researchers in Israel say the discovery transforms our understanding of how we are protected against infections. And the UK Defence Secretary John Healey is in Washington today to talks with his US counterpart Pete Hegseth. According to Britain's Ministry of Defence, the two are expected to discuss a peace plan for Ukraine. It follows President Trump's announcement to pause military aid to the war-torn country. Let's take a look at the top business news now. Oil prices were steady on Thursday, recovering slightly from a multi-year low. However, Brent was still below $70 a barrel as prices fall after President Donald Trump enacted tariffs on the US, Canada, Mexico, China, and also as OPEC Plus plans to raise output. Oil has stabilized after America said it will make automakers exempt from the 25% tariffs. Shares have jumped in European automakers after President Trump gave car makers a one-month reprieve from those 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Stellantis has thanked Trump for the tariff pause and is pledging more American-made cars. Beside its US plants, Stellantis operates facilities in both Mexico and also Canada. Turning to sports news now, Liverpool goalkeeper Alisson Becker put on a show that was fit for a king as his team snatched a 1-0 win away in Paris. Paris Saint-Germain weren't able to find a way past Alisson despite their 27 shots, which helped Liverpool survive the Champions League last 16 first leg on Wednesday. Harvey Elliott's strike was the only goal putting Liverpool in the driving seat for a place in the quarter-finals against either Aston Villa or Club Brugge. And the buzz around talented teenagers Mira Andreeva and Joa Finesco continue at Indian Wells. That's as some of the world's top tennis players, including Jessica Pegula, are tipping that the pair to have the major impact on the sport. 17-year-old Russian Andreeva became the youngest player to win a WTA 1000 title when she won in Dubai last month, breaking into the top 10. Brazilian Finesco, who is currently unseeded, does begin his first Indian Wells campaign against England's Jacob Fernley on Thursday. A reminder of our top stories. A watershed moment. EU leaders hold an emergency summit in Brussels on defence and also Ukraine aid. Trump issues a last warning to Hamas to release hostages in Gaza. And UK Defence Secretary John Healey touches down in Washington for talks with his US counterpart Pete Hegseth. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. Riz Khan is coming up next. And of course, don't miss Tom Burgess Watson with GNT. Good night and have a good evening.